Sometimes a simple fence can start a war. We are exploring 33 of the weirdest neighbor disputes in the United States. Stories so strange, they challenge everything you think you know about suburban life. By the end, you will understand the hidden psychology that turns friendly neighbors into bitter rivals over the most trivial of issues. What begins with a misplaced mailbox or a noisy chicken can spiral into legal battles over garden gnomes and accusations of squirrel-based espionage. How far would you go over a dispute about a tree branch? One neighbor's act of kindness can become another's nightmare. This was the core of the great squirrel feud of suburbia, a conflict that sprouted from a simple bird feeder. It began when a homeowner, let's call him Bob, decided to cultivate a sanctuary for local wildlife. He started with a few handfuls of nuts, but his generosity quickly escalated into daily, massive offerings. Squirrels, being clever and opportunistic, took full advantage. They did not stay in Bob's yard. A population explosion occurred next door, where the constant pitter-patter of tiny feet in the attic became a maddening soundtrack for his neighbor, Sarah. What started as polite requests to scale back the feeding erupted into full-scale warfare. Sarah installed ultrasonic repellents and slippery metal baffles on her own trees. Bob allegedly retaliated by tampering with her bird feeders, accusations he vehemently denied. The battle escalated from passive aggression to psychological operations. Reports surfaced, later detailed in local hearings, of a mysterious figure spotted at dawn, a person dressed in a remarkably unconvincing, oversized squirrel costume, allegedly trying to shoo the animals back onto Sarah's property. The spectacle baffled onlookers and deepened the animosity. Eventually, the local wildlife authorities were dragged into the mess, forced to mediate a conflict they never anticipated. Sarah's legal argument claimed intentional nuisance and property damage, citing chewed electrical wires and ruined garden plants as direct results of Bob's actions. Bob's defense was one of principle, arguing for his right to feed God's creatures on his own land. The entire affair laid bare how quickly a disagreement over nature can spiral into something utterly surreal, proving that in suburbia, the line between a good neighbor and a sworn enemy can be drawn with a single acorn. That invisible line in the grass became a battlefield for two families. What started as a simple solution for one dog owner spiraled into a bitter conflict over property and perceived psychological warfare against a pet. One neighbor, Mark, installed an underground electric fence to keep his energetic golden retriever safely contained. The system relied on a buried wire that created an invisible boundary, and when the dog wearing a special collar approached it, the collar would emit a warning beep followed by a mild static correction. The problem was his neighbors, the Carters, insisted the boundary wire was not entirely on Mark's property. They claimed it crossed a good 10 feet into their yard, a strip of land they considered their dog's primary relief area. The Carters argued that their own elderly terrier was now terrified to step onto its own familiar turf, exhibiting signs of what they called severe psychological distress. They described how their dog would approach the edge of the lawn, whimper, and then scurry back to the porch, seemingly repelled by an unseen force. This accusation of canine trespassing, of an invisible barrier tormenting an innocent animal, became the heart of their grievance. The dispute quickly escalated beyond backyard arguments. Both families paid for separate property surveys, which frustratingly offered conflicting results, each supporting one family's claim over the other. The community became deeply divided. Some saw Mark as a careless property encroacher, while others viewed the Carters as overly sensitive and looking for a fight. It all culminated in small claims court, where the evidence took a surreal turn. The Carters presented a cell phone video as their star exhibit. The grainy footage showed their terrier trotting happily across the lawn before suddenly stopping, its head cocking as if hearing something. The dog then let out a confused yelp, spun in a circle, and ran back toward the house. The Carters argued this was clear proof of the collar's activation zone crossing the property line. Mark's defense was that the dog was simply startled by a squirrel or a distant noise, and that the invisible fence was a widely accepted and safe containment method. The emotional toll was palpable. Two families who had once exchanged holiday greetings now communicated only through lawyers and formal complaints. The case was eventually settled with a mandated resurvey and an agreement for Mark to adjust the fence's boundaries, but the neighborly trust was irreparably shattered, all over an invisible line that only the dogs could truly sense. A garden is supposed to be a peaceful retreat, but for some neighbors it becomes a battlefield of petty aesthetics. Our third dispute began with what one homeowner considered a delightful collection. It started innocently enough with a few ceramic gnomes, but over the course of a single summer, the population exploded to over 100. They were not scattered whimsically, however. Every single one of them, from the fisherman to the sleepy fellow, was meticulously arranged to face the neighbor's house. Their unblinking ceramic stares, day and night, were interpreted not as a celebration of folklore, but as a calculated campaign of gnome-based intimidation. The beleaguered neighbor argued in a formal complaint that the sheer number of fixed gazes created an oppressive atmosphere, making his own backyard feel like he was under constant, silent surveillance by a small, painted army. He claimed it was psychological warfare disguised as garden decor. This perceived aggression did not go unanswered, and it bled directly into our fourth dispute, the rose bush retaliation. The same neighbor, feeling besieged by gnomes, owned a single, magnificent prize-winning rose bush that was the envy of the street. When it suddenly and mysteriously wilted and died within a matter of days, he had no doubt about the culprit. He accused the gnome collector of deliberate poisoning, a charge that was met with feigned ignorance. The response was swift and brutal. Instead of filing another official complaint, the rosebush owner launched a full-scale horticultural war. He planted a specific, fast-growing, and notoriously thorny vine along the entire property line. This was not a simple hedge, it was a vegetative barricade intended to grow dense and high, blocking the view of the gnomes but also casting a deep shadow over the collector's own prized flower beds. The evidence gathered by both sides descended into the bizarre. The gnome collector presented time-stamped photos attempting to prove the vines were encroaching on his property by millimeters each week. The rose bush owner, in turn, submitted a soil sample analysis to the homeowners association that showed traces of a common herbicide, though he could never definitively prove how it was applied. The entire conflict became a lesson in how passive aggression, when expressed through landscaping, can create a living, growing monument to spite that everyone is forced to look at every single day. Holiday cheer can curdle into seasonal warfare with astonishing speed. The Christmas light blackout began with one house that aimed to outshine the sun. Its holiday display featured over 100,000 lights, synchronized to music that boomed until 11 each night. For the neighbor directly across the street, the relentless crimson and green glow penetrated his living room, making television viewing impossible and casting a perpetual, festive shadow over his entire home. His polite requests to dial back the intensity were dismissed as an attack on community spirit, so he escalated. He erected a massive 20-foot-high wooden fence along his property line, painted a flat, light-absorbing black. It was a stark, joyless barrier specifically designed to block the holiday spectacle. The light show owner perceived this not as a solution, but as a declaration of war. His retaliation was an act of pure audacity. He reprogrammed his entire display, abandoning cheerful carols and instead synchronizing his 100,000 lights to a blistering heavy metal soundtrack. The aggressive, strobing lights now pulsed against the black fence in a furious, silent rhythm, a bizarre clash of Christmas tradition and sonic aggression that left the entire block bewildered. This uneasy standoff paved the way for the Halloween decoration détente, another street, another holiday, and one homeowner's passion for hyper-realistic scares. He transformed his yard into a chilling graveyard, complete with a motion-activated zombie that would lurch from a coffin with a blood-curdling shriek. It was a masterpiece of macabre until it allegedly proved too effective. The neighbor's elderly dachshund, startled during a late-night bathroom break, suffered a fatal heart attack. The grief-stricken owners did not just see a tragic accident, they saw negligence. They filed a lawsuit for emotional distress and the vet bills, arguing the display constituted an intentional nuisance that created an unreasonable danger. The case never made it to a full trial, but it forced a mediated agreement, a true neighborhood détente. The horror enthusiast had to disable the motion sensor after 9 p.m., and the zombie's lurch was replaced with a far less terrifying slow rise. This fragile peace, however, was shattered months later by the 4th of July firework fiasco. A family known for their extravagant and technically illegal backyard fireworks display lit a multi-stage rocket that veered wildly off course. It crashed directly into the canopy of a majestic 100-year-old oak tree on the neighboring property, igniting it instantly. The fire department's arrival turned a private celebration into a public spectacle, saving the home but not the cherished tree. The dispute that followed was not a simple apology. It evolved into a years-long battle over the cost of the tree's removal and replacement, which ran into thousands of dollars and intensified into a broader campaign against the family's reckless behavior. The aggrieved neighbor began meticulously documenting every firework violation, leading to fines and eventually a city-wide review of its fireworks ordinances. A single errant spark transformed a celebration of independence into a permanent rift, proving that the fallout from a neighbor's party can burn for years after the last ember has cooled. A shared driveway should be a symbol of cooperation, not a canvas for conflict. This particular battle began with a simple painted line down the center, a boundary that soon proved insufficient for one neighbor's need for absolute precision. He became convinced with an almost religious fervor that his neighbor's tires were consistently encroaching by mere millimeters onto his side of the divide. He began a campaign of meticulous documentation, photographing the parked cars from multiple angles each day and using a digital laser measure to log the infinitesimal violations. The situation escalated from passive observation to active fortification when he installed a physical divider, a low, rigid concrete curb running the entire length of the driveway. This turned a theoretical line into an unyielding, car-scraping reality. His legal argument was one of enforced clarity, claiming his neighbor's parking created a constant state of psychological pressure, an intentional invasion of his spatial rights. The other neighbor, in turn, filed a counterclaim arguing the divider violated their shared easement rights and constituted a deliberate nuisance. The driveway became a stage for high-tech surveillance. The first neighbor mounted several security cameras, their lenses focused with obsessive detail on the strip of concrete, recording every arrival and departure. The absurdity peaked when he began deploying a consumer-grade drone, its soft buzz becoming a familiar sound as it hovered overhead, allegedly to capture aerial proof of parking transgressions from the perfect angle. This airborne monitoring raised new legal questions about privacy and harassment, transforming a dispute over inches into a futuristic feud watched from the sky. The court was eventually asked to rule on a case involving a concrete curb, thousands of time-stamped photos, and drone footage, all to answer one simple, maddening question. Where does one person's property truly end and another's begin when a single inch of pavement holds so much meaning? A treehouse is meant to be a castle in the air, a sanctuary for childhood imagination. But in one American backyard, a magnificent fort built in a massive oak tree became the focal point of a property war. The problem was not the treehouse itself, but the tree. The ancient oak's gnarled trunk grew directly atop the surveyed property line, making its canopy and everything in it a shared possession. One family, the Wilsons, built the elaborate structure as a surprise for their children, believing they were exercising their right to improve their own land. Their neighbors, the Clarks, saw it very differently. They argued the entire project was an unauthorized encroachment, an act of territorial aggression disguised as a gift. The core of the dispute quickly shifted from the treehouse's location to its use. Whose children had the right to play in it? The Wilsons insisted it was theirs as they had funded and built it. The Clarks countered that their own children were now unfairly excluded from a play space that literally hovered over their property, creating a daily spectacle of envy and exclusion. The conflict escalated from a disagreement into a full-scale bureaucratic siege. The Clarks, citing vague but alarming concerns about structural integrity, began demanding formal, weekly safety inspections from the city. They filed requests citing potential fire hazards, insufficient railing heights, and even the theoretical weight load of too many children. Each inspection request was a volley in a paper war designed to burden the Wilsons with constant official scrutiny. The emotional toll was immense, with children from both families watching as their parents argued over a wooden platform that was supposed to represent fun and freedom. The strange and heartbreaking compromise proposals began to surface during mediation. One family suggested a formal, shared custody schedule for the treehouse, with specific days and hours allocated to each set of children, complete with a sign-in sheet to be posted on the ladder. Another proposal involved the installation of a second, separate entrance ladder, with one on each family's side of the property line, a plan that was as logistically absurd as it was symbolically divided. The legal battle that followed asked a surreal question: could a child's plaything be considered an act of aggression? The Clarks' lawsuit framed it not as a treehouse, but as an illegally constructed outbuilding that created a nuisance and intentionally provoked emotional distress. The case lingered in the courts for months, a sad testament to how a symbol of innocence could become a monument to adult conflict, its shadow falling not just on two properties, but on the childhoods playing out below. A scenic mountain view can feel like a part of your home until a piece of technology suddenly blocks it. This was the heart of the satellite dish skirmish, a conflict that started when one homeowner installed a large, state-of-the-art satellite dish to get a perfect television signal. The dish itself was perfectly legal and on his property, but its placement was strategically disastrous. It sat directly in the sideline of his next-door neighbor's living room window, blotting out a cherished vista of the distant peaks. The neighbor did not just see an obstruction, he saw the theft of a view he had paid a premium for. His argument centered on the concept of view rights, a legally murky but emotionally powerful idea that a property's value includes what you can see from it. The dish owner countered with his own right to use his property and enjoy modern amenities. This disagreement over a slice of the sky quickly descended into technical warfare. The view-deprived neighbor began alleging that the massive dish was causing signal interference with his own smaller satellite receiver and his home Wi-Fi network. He presented pages of internet speed tests and logs of pixelated television shows as evidence of deliberate electronic sabotage. The dish owner, in turn, produced official documentation from his satellite company stating his equipment was fully compliant and could not possibly cause such issues. The battle lines were drawn not just over land, but over the very airwaves between their homes. The retaliation was both petty and brilliant. The neighbor, feeling unheard, decided to fight technology with technology. He applied for a license and erected an enormous amateur radio antenna in his own backyard, a towering structure of metal and wires that deliberately loomed over the property line. This was not for communication, it was for statement. He claimed it was for his new hobby in Citizens Band radio, but its sheer size and proximity to the original satellite dish created a legitimate concern about physical and signal interference, turning a one-sided obstruction into a mutual technological standoff. The conflict inevitably drew in higher powers. the local homeowners association was flooded with dueling complaints about aesthetic violations and property value depreciation. Simultaneously, the Federal Communications Commission received formal inquiries from both sides, each accusing the other of operating unlicensed equipment that created harmful interference. The dispute became a bureaucratic nightmare, with official forms and regulatory codes being weaponized in a war over a view. The pettiness reached its peak with a simple yet effective act of hydrological aggression. The dish owner noticed that after a rainstorm, his prized equipment was consistently splattered with mud. He discovered his neighbor had subtly redirected a downspout from his own roof gutter, ensuring that rainwater would arc directly onto the satellite dish. This was not enough to cause damage, but it was a constant, dripping reminder of the animosity, a daily nuisance that required cleaning and kept the conflict fresh. The entire saga proved that when a neighbor feels wronged, even the clearest blue sky can become a battlefield for signals, sightlines, and spite. Even the air itself can become a weapon in a neighborly feud. The compost pile controversy began with one homeowner's commitment to sustainable living. He maintained a large compost heap in his backyard, a rich, dark mound of decaying vegetable matter and yard clippings. To him, it was a symbol of environmental responsibility. To his next-door neighbor, it was the source of an unbearable, pungent stench that wafted into his home on the slightest breeze, making it impossible to enjoy his own yard or even keep his windows open on a summer day. The conflict escalated from polite complaints to accusations of biological warfare. The aggrieved neighbor claimed the compost heap was a public health hazard, attracting a thriving population of rats and flies that then migrated onto his property. He documented the vermin with photographs and filed official complaints with the local health department. The composter, in turn, made a shocking counter-accusation. He claimed his neighbor was not an innocent victim but an active saboteur. He alleged that under the cover of darkness, the man was intentionally introducing rotting meat and other putrid materials into the compost pile, deliberately creating the foul odor to build a case against him. This created an unresolvable loop of blame, with each man accusing the other of being the true source of the offensive smell. If that was a war of scents, then the next conflict was a battle of sounds. The wind chime clash erupted when one neighbor's passion for harmonic resonance spiraled into what others described as auditory torture. It started with a few gentle, tinkling chimes, but over time the collection grew to over 50 individual sets. They were not a harmonious choir, but a chaotic orchestra of clanging tubes, clattering shells, and droning bamboo, all activated by the slightest gust of wind. For the neighbor, the constant, unpredictable symphony was maddening. It disrupted phone calls, made concentration impossible, and most critically, led to severe sleep deprivation as the chimes sang through the night. Pleas to reduce the number of chimes or to take them down at night were dismissed as an attack on artistic expression and the homeowner's right to enjoy their property. The sleep-deprived neighbor felt he had no legal recourse that would act quickly enough, so he took matters into his own hands. His retaliation was both ingenious and petty. He purchased a high-powered, industrial-grade water gun, the kind used for cleaning gutters. From the secrecy of his own second-story window, he would take aim and fire precise streams of water at the chimes whenever the wind picked up. The water would dampen the clappers and sticks, effectively silencing them for hours. This clandestine campaign worked for a short time, until the chime owner grew suspicious of the strangely specific periods of silence and discovered the water gun operator in the act. This led to a new round of accusations involving trespass, property damage from water, and the creation of a new, equally frustrating nuisance. The two disputes, one of smell and one of sound, reveal a simple truth in suburban life. Your right to enjoy your property can feel utterly violated by a neighbor's right to enjoy theirs, leaving everyone trapped in a sensory battlefield with no easy escape. A simple basketball hoop can turn a driveway into a legal war zone. In this dispute, a family installed a regulation height hoop at the end of their paved driveway, a perfect spot for their kids to practice their jump shots. The problem was physics. A missed shot meant the ball would often bounce, roll, or even fly directly into the neighbor's meticulously manicured yard. At first, it was a minor annoyance, with the neighbor tossing the ball back over the fence with a forced smile. But as the games grew more frequent, so did the intrusions. The neighbor began documenting every single incident, logging the date and time each ball crossed the property line. He claimed this constant invasion constituted a deliberate pattern of sport-induced trespass, arguing that the family was using his property as an extension of their own court. The situation escalated from cold shoulders to outright sabotage. The family started finding their basketballs mysteriously deflated, each one sporting a small, precise puncture wound. Accusations flew, but without proof, the basketball owner could only seethe and buy more balls. The retaliation grew more formal. The neighbor invested in a tall, industrial-grade netting system, erecting a barrier along the property line that looked less like a privacy screen and more like a fence at a driving range. This netting, however, did not stop the conflict. It amplified it, creating a visible, physical monument to the feud that everyone on the street had to see. The breaking point was both literal and figurative. During a particularly energetic game, a wayward ball sailed over the new netting and struck the neighbor's living room window, shattering a large pane of glass. The family apologized, but when presented with the repair bill, they refused to pay. They argued it was a genuine accident and that the neighbor had contributed to the situation by creating an environment of hostility. This refusal transformed the dispute from a neighborhood spat into a legal nightmare. The neighbor filed a lawsuit not just for the window, but for the broader pattern of trespass and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The case hinged on a bizarre legal question. Could the predictable bounce of a basketball be considered a deliberate invasion of property? The court was asked to rule on the very nature of play, accident, and responsibility, proving that even a child's game can be stripped of all its joy and turned into a bitter lesson in liability. Sometimes the very air around your home can feel stolen. The air conditioning unit altercation began with a large, industrial-grade outdoor condenser installed by a homeowner seeking perfect climate control. The unit was legally placed on his property, but its location was a disaster for his neighbor. It sat right alongside their shared property line, its mechanical hum a constant, droning presence that vibrated through the walls, disrupting sleep and turning quiet evenings into a test of endurance. The neighbor argued this was more than a nuisance. It was an invasive force degrading his quality of life. The conflict intensified with the weather. The air conditioner's exhaust vent blasted a stream of hot air directly into the neighbor's open windows during the spring and fall, effectively heating his home from the outside and forcing his own cooling system to work overtime. He began meticulously tracking his energy bills, presenting them as evidence of a direct financial injury caused by his neighbor's appliance. His argument was one of tangible loss, claiming the unwanted heat transfer was a form of trespass that cost him real money every single month. The technical arguments grew increasingly complex. The unit's owner produced decibel readings from a sound meter to prove the noise was within legal limits, while the neighbor hired an acoustic consultant who testified that the low-frequency nature of the hum was particularly disruptive and not fully captured by standard measurements. Proposals for a solution were just as divisive. The aggrieved neighbor suggested the unit's owner pay to construct a tall, sound-baffling wall, an expensive structure that would essentially cage the machine. The owner refused, arguing he shouldn't have to pay for a fortress on his own land. The debate reached its peak of absurdity during a particularly heated mediation session. Frustrated by the deadlock over property lines and physics, the air conditioner's owner reportedly looked at his neighbor and offered a solution that defied all logic. He said, "If the hot air and noise are such a problem for you, maybe you should just move your house back a few feet." This statement, meant to be dismissive, perfectly encapsulated the core of so many neighbor disputes, a complete refusal to see the other person's reality, where the simplest solution in one mind is an impossible demand in the other. Even the most mundane routines can ignite the strangest of wars. The mailbox mayhem began with a shared, classic mailbox that had served two homes for decades. It was a simple, unremarkable box until one neighbor decided it was outdated and vulnerable. Without a single word of consultation, he replaced the communal fixture with a sleek, modern, locking mailbox. To him, this was an upgrade in security. To his neighbor, it was an act of unilateral territorial seizure. The locked box meant she could no longer casually retrieve her own mail, and she immediately accused him of deliberately holding her letters hostage or even stealing them. The conflict escalated from simmering resentment to a full-blown public spectacle when the local postmaster got involved. Attempting to mediate, the postmaster was caught in the middle of a shouting match that turned physical. One neighbor, in a fit of frustration over a missed utility bill, allegedly shoved the other, causing the postmaster to stumble and drop an entire armful of sorted mail into a muddy puddle. This single shove transformed a petty disagreement into a formal police report for assault, with the sanctity of the United States Postal Service dragged into the heart of the feud. This atmosphere of delivery-based suspicion paved the way for the porch pirate proxy war. In this conflict, one neighbor worked from home and would often receive packages for his neighbor, holding them safely until she returned. This casual favor soured after a dispute over a loud party. The work-from-home neighbor felt slighted and enacted a chillingly passive-aggressive punishment. He stopped bringing in the packages. He would watch from his window as delivery drivers left boxes on her doorstep, and he would simply let them sit there, exposed and vulnerable for hours. The predictable outcome was theft. When multiple packages were stolen, the woman did not blame random criminals. She immediately accused her neighbor of intentional negligence. Her argument was that by refusing a long-established neighborhood courtesy, he had become an accomplice to the porch pirates, a proxy in their crime. She began documenting his presence at home during deliveries, presenting time-stamped photos of his car in the driveway as proof that he could have acted but chose not to. The retaliation was equally indirect. She signed his address up for a torrent of unwanted catalogs and charity solicitations, flooding his mailbox with junk as a petty revenge for the packages she lost. The final battleground in this domestic trifecta was the garbage can confrontation. Trash collection day became a weekly exercise in tactical maneuvering. The rules were simple. Bins needed to be on a specific side of the street for the automated truck to reach them. One neighbor, a stickler for pristine curb appeal, became enraged that his neighbor's cans were consistently placed a few feet over the property line, marring the symmetry of the street. His solution was not a conversation, but a covert campaign of relocation. Under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, he would sneak out and move the offending bins to the opposite side of the street, ensuring they were in the wrong position for collection. The result was uncollected trash week after week. The victim of this garbage can sabotage was initially baffled, blaming the sanitation department, but after setting up a motion-activated camera, he captured the culprit in the act. The footage showed his neighbor, dressed in a bathrobe and slippers, calmly rolling the bins across the asphalt. The confrontation that followed was a foul-smelling standoff. The aggrieved neighbor began leaving his overflowing, uncollected cans directly on the property line for days, a putrid monument to the dispute. The stench became a weapon, and the entire block was forced to endure the consequences of a war fought with waste, proving that no part of daily life is safe from the spiral of neighborly spite. That neon pink fence was not just a color, it was a declaration. When one homeowner decided to unilaterally paint their side of a shared wooden fence a shocking electric pink, the reaction was immediate and visceral. The neighbor was horrified. His serene backyard vista, once a palette of greens and browns, was now dominated by a wall of screaming magenta. His argument was not merely about taste, but about value. He claimed the garish color was an act of aesthetic aggression that directly devalued his property, making his home harder to sell and turning his private oasis into a joke. The fence painter countered that it was his property, his side of the fence, and therefore his absolute right to choose any color he desired. This forced the community to confront a bizarre philosophical question: does a fence have a right side and a wrong side, or are the two faces forever locked in a battle for visual dominance? The retaliation was swift and deliberately ugly. Unable to legally force a repainting, the aggrieved neighbor erected a makeshift barrier on his own property. He hung heavy-duty blue tarps and even old frayed carpets over the entire length of the fence, blocking the pink from his view but creating an eyesore that was now visible to the entire neighborhood. His logic was simple: if he had to suffer an unsightly view, then everyone else would suffer one too, in the hopes that public pressure would force a change. This turned a private dispute into a public spectacle, with the street now featuring one brilliant pink wall and one shabby, multicolored barricade right behind it. The conflict inevitably entered the legal arena, where it sparked a debate over the concept of a spite color. The offended neighbor petitioned the local homeowners association and even the city council, arguing for a new ordinance that would prohibit paints of an excessively bright or unnatural hue on exterior fences visible from other properties or the street. He presented color swatches and testimonies from real estate agents about the negative impact on home values. The fence painter, in turn, fought this as government overreach and a violation of his creative freedom. The case became a landmark in the neighborhood's history, not for its resolution, but for the precedent it set, proving that a single can of paint could redraw the lines of community standards and turn a simple boundary into a blazing, neon-bright war zone. A swimming pool should be a source of relaxation, not the epicenter of a geological and social earthquake. The conflict erupted when one family installed a massive in-ground pool, a project that required weeks of excavation and heavy machinery rumbling right next to the property line. Almost immediately, the neighbor began noticing thin, jagged cracks snaking across their basement walls. They were convinced the constant, ground-shaking construction had compromised the very foundation of their home. Their argument was one of cause and effect, a direct physical assault on their property's structural integrity. The pool owners dismissed the cracks as simple settling, a common occurrence in older homes, but the neighbor was not swayed. They hired a structural engineer whose report pointed to recent, significant soil disturbance as the likely culprit, a finding the pool family immediately contested with a report from their own, equally qualified expert. This clash of engineering opinions turned a backyard renovation into a high-stakes legal battle over whose science was correct. The dispute then flooded into the realm of daily life with accusations of noise nuisance. The pool family loved to host, and their weekend parties featured loud music, shouting, and the constant splash of swimmers that would carry late into the night. For the neighbor, this was no longer just about cracks in the basement. It was an unending auditory invasion they dubbed hydro-terrorism, a deliberate campaign of water-based annoyance. The most bizarre accusation, however, involved the pool itself. The neighbor claimed the brilliant cobalt blue pool liner was not an aesthetic choice but a weapon. They alleged it was specifically selected to act as a giant mirror, reflecting a blinding, concentrated glare of sunlight directly into their upstairs windows. This created a daily phenomenon where their living room would be flooded with an intense, shimmering light, making it unbearably hot and bright for hours each afternoon. They presented photographs showing the precise angle of the glare, arguing it was an intentional act of optical aggression. The conflict inevitably drew in their insurance companies, who now had to untangle whether the foundational damage was an act of God or an act of neighbor. The situation reached its dramatic peak during a particularly raucous pool party. The aggrieved neighbor, seeking irrefutable evidence of the noise and crowd levels, launched a consumer drone. The device buzzed over the party like a mechanical insect, its camera capturing the revelers below. This invasion of privacy, however, backfired spectacularly. The pool guests, startled and angered by the drone, began shouting and pointing at the hovering device. The footage, which was meant to prove the nuisance, instead became evidence in a counterclaim for harassment and illegal surveillance, proving that in the quest for evidence, one can easily cross a line and become the villain in the story. A simple statue can become a lightning rod for conflict. This dispute ignited when a homeowner installed a large, illuminated statue of a religious figure in their front yard. The figure was not facing the street, but was positioned to look directly at the neighbor's living room window, its gentle glow piercing the evening darkness. The neighbors felt this was not an act of faith, but a targeted campaign of proselytizing. They argued the constant, unblinking gaze created a hostile visual environment, turning their own home into an unwilling participant in a religious display. Their formal complaint centered on the idea of psychological pressure, claiming the statue's placement was an intentional act meant to intimidate and discomfort them. The statue owner's defense was one of principle, citing their constitutional right to religious expression on their own property. They stated the statue provided them with great comfort and that its orientation was a matter of personal spiritual significance, not an attack on anyone. The community fractured along unexpected lines. Some saw the statue as a beautiful symbol and defended the homeowner's rights, while others sympathized with the feeling of being visually accosted in their own home, arguing that rights end where harassment begins. The situation grew so contentious that civil liberties organizations got involved, each side backed by a different group arguing for either religious freedom or protection from a hostile living environment. The proposed compromises grew increasingly strange in an attempt to satisfy both absolute positions. One mediator suggested the statue be placed on a rotating platform, turning slowly throughout the day so its gaze was not permanently fixed on one home. Another proposal involved the installation of a timed switch for the internal light, turning it off at a certain hour each night to restore the neighbor's darkness. The statue owner rejected these as absurd infringements on their devotion, while the neighbor saw them as insufficient concessions. The standoff revealed how deeply a symbol of peace can divide when one person's solace becomes another's sentence. Even the most rustic of sounds can be weaponized in a neighbor dispute. The chicken opera began with one homeowner's passion for urban farming, maintaining a small flock of hens in a beautifully constructed coop. The problem was the dawn chorus. Every single morning, without fail, the chickens would greet the sunrise with a cacophony of clucks and crows that the neighbor described as a relentless, sleep-shattering alarm clock. The chicken owner, an artist by trade, reframed the entire situation. He did not apologize for the noise, he celebrated it. In response to the first noise complaint, he sent his neighbor a beautifully calligraphed pamphlet, declaring the daily clucking to be a form of spontaneous avian opera, a unique and protected artistic expression born from the harmony of nature and his own stewardship. He argued that to silence the chickens would be to censor a living performance. The neighbor, now chronically sleep-deprived, was not amused. He began his own form of documentation, but his was a log of decibel levels recorded at 5 a.m., which he presented to code enforcement as evidence of a clear and persistent nuisance. The feud escalated into a philosophical battle fought with city ordinances. The chicken owner attempted to have his backyard designated a temporary art space, while the aggrieved neighbor circulated a petition signed by other residents tired of the early morning serenades. The conflict reached its surreal peak when the chicken owner, in a bid to prove the artistic merit of his flock, live-streamed the 5 a.m. clucking online with a title calling it Dawn Chorus in D minor. This digital performance did little to sway the authorities, who ultimately ruled that no matter how beautifully framed, a rooster's crow at daybreak was still a violation of local noise laws. This rural idealism clashed directly with another unconventional pet strategy in the goat gambit. Another neighbor, seeking an eco-friendly solution to lawn care, acquired 2 pygmy goats. They were adorable, efficient, and surprisingly adept at escape. The goats quickly learned to nudge open a loose section of fencing, and their wanderlust had a very specific destination: the neighbor's meticulously maintained vegetable garden. The gardener would wake to find his prize-winning tomatoes nibbled to the stem and his carrot tops completely vanished. His initial frustration turned to fury when he noticed the goats seemed to bypass every other plant on their journey directly to his plot. He accused the goat owner of animal-enabled trespass, a deliberate and negligent use of livestock to destroy his property. The goat owner's counter-accusation was a masterpiece of deflection. He did not deny the goats had gotten out, but he claimed the gardener was partially at fault. He argued that the vegetables were simply too enticing, that the specific heirloom varieties were intentionally planted as a lure, creating an attractive nuisance that his goats could not reasonably be expected to resist. He suggested the gardener was essentially baiting his animals. This bizarre claim turned a simple case of broken fencing into a complex debate over responsibility and temptation. The gardener's retaliation was swift and agricultural. He surrounded his entire garden with a new, electrified fence, a dramatic and intimidating barrier that bathed his backyard in a faint, ominous buzzing. The goat owner then accused him of creating a dangerous, excessive hazard that traumatized his gentle goats. The 2 households became locked in a standoff, one man guarding his vegetables with a miniature cattle fence, the other insisting his lawnmowers were the true victims, a perfect example of how a quest for a simpler, natural solution can spiral into the most complicated of conflicts. The sharp crack of a musket shot is not a sound anyone expects on a Tuesday afternoon. This marked the beginning of the historical reenactment ruckus, a conflict that erupted when one neighbor's passion for the past collided with the present-day peace of a suburban street. He was a dedicated historical reenactor, and his backyard became a training ground for 18th-century warfare. He would drill for hours, firing blanks from his musket, but the grand spectacle was a replica cannon. Its thunderous boom, even without a projectile, would shake windows and send plumes of thick, acrid smoke drifting over the fence. For his immediate neighbors, it was terrifying. The sudden, unexpected blasts caused pets to panic, startled children, and left one neighbor, a military veteran, grappling with severe anxiety. They did not see a hobbyist, they saw a man conducting a one-man siege in a quarter-acre lot. The retaliation was both clever and despairing. The most affected neighbor erected a large, hand-painted wooden sign on his side of the fence, facing the reenactor's property. It read, "Fort Neighbor," a sarcastic declaration that his home was now under constant threat. This public shaming did not curb the activities, it only fueled the reenactor's sense of being misunderstood. He argued he was a living historian, preserving the sights and sounds of a pivotal era for future generations. The dispute plunged into a legal gray area. Local ordinances clearly prohibited the discharge of firearms, but were historical replicas firing only blanks considered firearms? The police were called on multiple occasions, each time leaving with conflicting interpretations of the law. The reenactor presented permits from historical societies and argued his blank charges were no more dangerous than a large firework. His neighbors countered that the noise and fear constituted a deliberate nuisance regardless of the technicalities. The debate raged in town hall meetings, pitting the passionate argument for preserving history against the fundamental right to domestic peace. Can the echo of a phantom cannon be allowed to shatter the real, present-day tranquility of an entire neighborhood? The question remained unanswered, a stalemate as immovable as the historical principles it was built upon. The sky itself became a contested territory in this high-tech feud. One neighbor, an avid photographer, began using a drone to capture stunning aerial shots of the neighborhood. The problem was his flight path. The device would frequently hover directly over his neighbor's backyard pool, its persistent, insect-like buzz shattering any sense of privacy. For the family below, the drone's camera felt like an unblinking electronic eye, making them feel like unwilling subjects in a reality show every time they stepped outside to swim or relax. Their argument was a modern take on an ancient right, claiming the airspace immediately above their home was part of their private domain. The photographer countered that the sky was public and he was operating well within Federal Aviation Administration guidelines for recreational use. This clash of old-world property rights and new-world technology escalated rapidly. The aggrieved family did not just file complaints, they fought back with technology of their own. They invested in a signal jammer, a device that could disrupt the drone's control link and global positioning system signal, causing it to lose control. On several occasions, the photographer watched in horror as his expensive machine suddenly wobbled and executed an emergency landing in his neighbor's yard, where it would be held hostage until he apologized for the intrusion. This act of electronic warfare transformed the dispute from a nuisance into a dangerous game. The photographer argued the jammers were illegal and created a safety hazard, potentially causing his drone to crash into a person or property. He began meticulously logging every flight, presenting maps and timestamps to prove he never intentionally lingered over the pool. The family, in turn, presented their own evidence, a folder filled with grainy images captured from their security cameras, showing the distinct silhouette of the drone hovering directly above their children swimming. The legal system was forced to grapple with a question that would have been science fiction a generation earlier: how high does your property really go? The case culminated not just in a neighborhood ruling, but in a formal restraining order. A judge seeking a clear, enforceable boundary issued an order that specifically banned the photographer from operating any unmanned aircraft below an altitude of 100 feet over his neighbor's property. This created a bizarre, invisible ceiling, a legal force field in the sky. The ruling set a powerful precedent in the community, establishing that while the heavens might be free, the air above your backyard is a sanctuary that can be protected from prying lenses and electronic buzz. The air we breathe is supposed to be neutral territory, but for some neighbors it becomes a contaminated battlefield. The smoker's siege began with the simple act of one man enjoying an evening cigar on his patio. The smoke, however, did not linger in his own yard. It found a direct path into his neighbor's home, seeping through the exterior ventilation system for the central air conditioning. The neighbor, a severe asthmatic, claimed the smoke was not a mere annoyance but a genuine health hazard, triggering attacks and forcing his family to seal their windows even on perfect summer nights. His retaliation was technological. He installed an industrial-grade air purification system on his side of the property line, a hulking, expensive machine that hummed day and night, its very existence a constant, noisy reminder of the conflict. This led to a secondary dispute over the purifier's own noise, a perfect cycle of retaliation where every solution became a new problem. The principle of fresh air was weaponized again in the BBQ brawl. One family loved to host weekend barbecues, their grill billowing clouds of hickory and mesquite smoke that drifted directly over the fence. The neighbor did not complain about the noise of the party, but about the scent. She claimed the thick, greasy smoke permeated everything, forcing her to retreat indoors and leaving a persistent, unpleasant odor clinging to her outdoor laundry drying on the line. Her argument was one of sensory trespass, that her right to enjoy her yard and have clean-smelling clothes was being stolen by her neighbor's culinary habits. The conflict escalated from polite requests to outright sabotage. One Saturday, as the smoke poured over the fence, she dragged her own garden hose to the property line and began spraying a fine mist of water into the air, attempting to literally wash the smoke particles from the sky. The barbecue host was incensed, accusing her of ruining his food and damaging his grill. The final olfactory offense was perhaps the most personal. The perfume protest centered on one woman's love for a particularly potent floral fragrance. She would apply it liberally before working in her garden, a cloud of scent preceding her. Her neighbor, living downwind, claimed to have a severe allergic reaction to the chemicals in the perfume, suffering from migraines and respiratory irritation. She did not frame this as a simple disagreement, but as a deliberate chemical assault, accusing the gardener of intentionally wearing the perfume when she knew her neighbor was outside. The accusations grew increasingly baroque, with the allergic neighbor alleging the perfume was being used as a biological weapon to force her to stay indoors. She began documenting her alleged symptoms in a detailed medical journal, presenting it to a homeowners association that was utterly unequipped to rule on the validity of a perfume allergy. These three disputes, fought over cigar smoke, barbecue vapor, and engineered florals, reveal a profound truth. When a smell you cannot control invades your personal space, it feels like a violation of your very self, turning the simple act of taking a breath into an act of war. A ceramic gnome vanished into the night, only to reappear days later holding a tiny handwritten sign. This was the opening salvo in the lawn ornament larceny, a feud built on bizarre thefts and psychological games. It started when one homeowner noticed their collection of garden gnomes and pink flamingos began to dwindle, a few pieces disappearing each week. The initial assumption was simple teenage pranks, but the pattern soon revealed a more calculated campaign. The ornaments would not be gone for good. They would mysteriously return to the lawn days later, but always in a different, unsettling position. A gnome would be found facing the wrong way, or a flamingo would be perched precariously on the roof gutter. The true escalation came with the ransom notes. They were not demands for money, but for changes in domestic behavior. One note, left tucked under a returned gnome's hat, demanded quieter lawn mowing on Saturday morning. Another, tied to a flamingo's leg, insisted on keeping outdoor lights off after 10 p.m. to reduce light pollution. The thief was not a random vandal, but a neighbor using ornament napping as a form of grievance resolution. The victim, feeling both violated and mocked, invested in a high-resolution security camera. The footage it captured was both conclusive and surreal. In the grainy, green-tinted night vision, a figure could be seen carefully digging up a gnome, polishing its pointy red hat with a cloth, and then placing it back on the lawn, but now aiming its fishing rod directly at the victim's bedroom window. This was not mere theft, it was a meticulously staged performance of psychological warfare. The police, when presented with the footage and the ransom notes, were deeply reluctant to get involved. They classified it as a civil neighbor dispute, with one officer reportedly asking if they were really expected to open a file for grand theft gnome. Their refusal to act only emboldened the perpetrator, who began leaving increasingly elaborate messages. One note detailed a complex schedule for acceptable garbage can placement, while another demanded a formal, written apology for a years-old disagreement about a fallen tree branch. The feud created a climate of paranoia, where every rearranged garden decoration felt like a coded message. The victims started analyzing the new positions of the returned ornaments, convinced they were a form of silent communication, a way for the neighbor to express contempt without ever having to speak. The entire conflict became a strange, public conversation conducted through stolen lawn art, proving that even the most whimsical of objects can be twisted into weapons in a silent war fought one flamingo at a time. The rhythmic thump of children bouncing became a source of seismic dread. An in-ground trampoline, sunken into the earth for a sleek look, was installed perilously close to the property line. To the family next door, it was not a source of joy but a daily assault. They argued the constant, percussive vibration was more than a mere annoyance. It was a tangible force they could feel through their floors. A shaking they feared was slowly but surely cracking their home's very foundation. Their complaint was not about noise but about physics, a claim that the earth itself was transmitting the impact of every jump. The trampoline owners were baffled, countering that their children were simply playing and that an in-ground model was specifically chosen to be less intrusive than an above-ground one. This forced a clash of expert opinions. The aggrieved neighbor hired a structural engineer whose report pointed to repetitive low-grade seismic activity as a likely contributor to newly discovered hairline cracks in the basement. The other family promptly produced their own engineer who testified that the vibrations were negligible, no greater than those caused by a passing truck or a slamming door. The argument in mediation became surreal, a debate over whether childhood exuberance could literally shake a house apart. The concept of joy as a nuisance was placed squarely on the table, with one side arguing their right to peaceful enjoyment of their property was being trampled by the literal trampling next door. Feeling utterly unheard, the complaining neighbor decided on a retaliation that was both towering and tongue-in-cheek. He obtained a permit and erected an exceptionally tall, thin flagpole right on the edge of his property, positioned to cast a long, thin shadow directly over the center of the trampoline. And from it he flew a custom-made flag. The flag did not bear a national emblem or a sports team logo. Instead, on a stark white background, in bold black letters, it read, "Bounce-free zone." This silent, flapping sarcasm turned a private dispute into a public joke, a daily reminder that one man's playground was another's personal earthquake zone. A political sign is not just a statement of belief, it can become a territorial marker. This dispute ignited during a heated election season, when two neighbors directly across the street from one another planted yard signs supporting opposing candidates. At first, it was a simple, if tense, display of civic engagement, but the conflict erupted when one sign was found ripped from the ground and mangled in the gutter. The owner did not blame random vandals. He immediately accused his political rival across the street. That accusation, delivered in a shouted confrontation at the curb, launched a bizarre arms race of signage. The vandalized sign was replaced with two even larger ones. The neighbor, refusing to be visually outdone, responded by planting three larger signs of his own. Within a week, their front lawns were not just expressing political views, they were engaged in a visual shouting match. The signs grew in size and number, transforming manicured grass into a forest of plywood and corrugated plastic, each one a deliberate escalation in a battle for ideological dominance of the street. The emotional charge was palpable, turning a simple walk to the mailbox into a tense, silent walk of protest. This visual warfare inevitably bled into the social fabric of the neighborhood. A casual block party intended as a neutral gathering became a minefield. The two families stood on opposite sides of the street, their interactions with other neighbors carefully monitored for signs of allegiance. A simple compliment about a dessert could be interpreted as a political endorsement, and conversations were strained, everyone acutely aware of the two warring lawns looming over the event. The core of the dispute made resolution nearly impossible. A mediator could suggest a compromise over a fence line or a tree branch, but how do you mediate a deeply held political conviction displayed on private property? The suggestion that both families simply take their signs down was rejected by both sides as a violation of their constitutional rights. One man argued that removing his sign would be tantamount to surrendering to the other side's tactics of intimidation. The other stated that his signs were a moral imperative, a necessary stand for his beliefs. The feud became a perfect storm where property rights, free speech, and raw political emotion collided, proving that the most divisive neighbor disputes are not over inches of land, but over irreconcilable inches of the mind. Water has a way of finding the weakest point, and in this case it was the property line. The rain-gutter rivalry began with a simple home improvement project. One neighbor installed a sleek, modern rain gutter system, routing all the water from his expansive roof into a single, powerful downspout. The problem was its placement. The downspout aimed like a cannon directly at his neighbor's yard, and with every rainfall, a torrent of water would gush across the property line. What began as minor puddling quickly escalated into serious soil erosion and eventually a flooded basement next door. The victim saw this not as an oversight but as a deliberate act of hydrological aggression, an intentional campaign of water dumping. His polite request to extend the downspout or add a splash block was met with a dismissive wave and a lecture about his own property's poor grading. The technical arguments became a battle of dueling experts. The flooded neighbor hired a landscaper who produced a detailed report showing how the concentrated runoff violated basic principles of drainage and was the direct cause of the erosion. The gutter owner, in turn, presented a survey from his own contractor arguing that the water was simply following the natural slope of the land and that his neighbor's basement was always prone to flooding. This clash of surveys turned a stream of water into a river of legal briefs. Feeling utterly cornered, the flooded neighbor decided to fight water with earth. His retaliation was a massive, hastily constructed berm, a mound of packed soil and gravel built right along the property line. This earthen wall was not subtle. It was a brute force barricade designed to do one thing: redirect every single drop of water back onto the gutter owner's lawn. The war was now being fought with landscaping. The gutter owner was furious, claiming the unsightly berm was causing water to pool against his own foundation. He then escalated by installing an even larger, industrial-grade French drain system to capture the redirected water and shunt it back toward the berm, creating a perfect, absurd cycle of hydrological spite. The entire block watched as these two men engaged in a silent, soggy battle, each using shovels and PVC pipe to wage a war where the only real winner was the water itself, forever being pushed back and forth across an invisible line in the mud. A brilliant array of solar panels promised one family lower energy bills and a smaller carbon footprint. For their next-door neighbor, however, that same installation created a daily phenomenon they called the dancing sun. As the sun traveled across the sky, its light would strike the panels at a precise angle, casting a blinding, reflective glare that swept slowly through their home. This was not a gentle glow, but an intense, concentrated beam that would move across their living room wall for hours, creating hot spots on their furniture and making certain rooms unbearable during the afternoon. The neighbor argued this was a new form of trespass, a solar trespass where light itself was being weaponized, intentionally or not, to degrade their quality of life. Their complaint was not against green energy, but against the specific, invasive consequence of its reflection. The panel owners were caught off guard, countering that they had every right to harness the sun on their own property and that their choice was a benefit to the environment. This forced a complex legal debate that pitted two deeply held rights against each other: the right to use your property for progressive energy solutions versus the right to peaceful enjoyment of your home without intrusive, man-made environmental conditions. The stakes were surprisingly high, tangled in government incentives for renewable energy. The complaining neighbor felt they were being asked to sacrifice their residential comfort for someone else's financial gain and environmental virtue, a subsidy paid for with their own daily annoyance. Studies were commissioned, with experts using specialized equipment to measure the lux intensity of the reflected glare, comparing it to acceptable ambient light levels. The results were often contentious, with one report concluding the light was a temporary, minor nuisance, while another declared it a significant visual and thermal intrusion. Proposed solutions were just as divisive. The aggrieved neighbor suggested the installation of an anti-glare coating on the panels, a costly retrofit the owners resisted. Another idea involved the construction of a tall privacy fence, but this would have cast a shadow over the panels themselves, drastically reducing their efficiency and defeating their entire purpose. The case became a modern parable, a clash between our collective future and our individual present, where the quest to capture a clean ray of sunshine for one household inadvertently stole the comfort of another. A single overhanging branch can cast a very long shadow. This final dispute began with something just that simple, a limb from a majestic oak tree that stretched a few feet over a property line. A polite request to trim it was met with a refusal, rooted in a fierce defense of the tree's natural form. That initial standoff over a piece of wood became the first domino in a chain reaction of paranoia, a spy versus spy saga that would consume two families for years. It started with a single security camera installed by one neighbor to supposedly monitor his own driveway. His rival across the fence, however, saw its angled lens as a deliberate invasion, a mechanical eye peering into his private life. His response was not a conversation but an escalation. He installed two cameras of his own, positioned with surgical precision to watch the first camera and the man who operated it. This was the opening move in a silent, digital arms race. Soon, both properties were encrusted with a bewildering array of surveillance technology. Bullet cameras peered from under eaves, discrete dome units rotated in soffits, and small, weatherproof enclosures were bolted to fence posts, all with one singular purpose: to watch the other house. The feeds were monitored obsessively, with both families spending hours reviewing footage, searching for any slight, any violation, any piece of evidence that could be used in the endless paper war of complaints filed with the homeowners association and local police. The psychological toll was immense. Normal life ceased to exist. A trip to take out the trash was performed under the unblinking gaze of a rival's lens, recorded and potentially scrutinized. Children's playdates in the backyard felt like performances for an unseen audience. The constant, oppressive feeling of being watched eroded trust and sanity, turning each home into a private panopticon where the warden lived directly across the street. The conflict then leapt from video to audio. One party, convinced the other was slandering him during backyard phone calls, invested in a powerful, long-range listening device, alleging it was to document threats. The target of this auditory surveillance discovered it and promptly countersued, alleging illegal wiretapping and a campaign of acoustic harassment. The legal fees began to spiral into the tens of thousands of dollars as motions and counter-motions flew. The final, most desperate escalation was the alleged involvement of private investigators. Rumors swirled through the neighborhood that both sides had hired professionals to dig into the other's past, to follow them on errands, and to find any leverage that could end the stalemate. The Cold War was now fully hot, a deeply personal conflict fought with the tools of corporate espionage. There was no dramatic courtroom verdict to end this. The battle concluded not with a bang, but with a pair of for sale signs. The legal and emotional wells had simply run dry. Both families, financially and psychologically exhausted, sold their homes at a loss just to escape the nightmare they had co-created. They left behind a neighborhood forever tinged with their legacy, a quiet street where the new owners sometimes wonder why the previous residents installed quite so many outdoor cameras, their blank lenses now staring at nothing at all. These bizarre battles over inches and acorns reveal a deep, often uncomfortable truth about human nature. Why does a fallen leaf or a misplaced garbage can trigger a response more suited to an international border crisis? The answer lies in a predictable psychological slide. It almost never begins with a drone or a neon fence. It starts with something tiny, a polite request ignored, a minor irritation left to fester. This is the foot in the door phenomenon of suburban warfare. Agreeing to that first small conflict, like letting a complaint fester, makes the next escalation feel justified. When your neighbor dismisses your concern about their noisy chicken, the step to filing a formal noise complaint no longer seems like an overreaction, but a necessary countermove. Each minor retaliation normalizes the next until you find yourself in a squirrel costume at dawn, wondering how it ever came to this. Pride is the fuel that keeps these engines of spite running long after the original spark has died. To back down, to be the first to apologize or remove the spite fence, feels like an admission of total defeat. It is no longer about the tree branch or the bouncing trampoline, it is about the principle. The principle becomes a shield for the ego. The financial cost of a legal battle or the social cost of being the neighborhood pariah becomes secondary to the unbearable notion of letting the other person win. Consider the shared treehouse, a conflict that ceased to be about children and became about which adult would surrender their claim to a wooden platform. The irrationality is the point, the bizarre behavior is a performance of unwavering resolve, a signal that you will not be the one to break. Our homes are our castles, and the property line is the moat. Any perceived incursion, whether by bouncing ball, drifting smoke, or unblinking gnome, feels like a violation of a sacred territory. This triggers a profound loss of control. You cannot control your neighbor's actions, but you can control your response, and that response often becomes a desperate attempt to reclaim sovereignty. The man who painted his fence a shocking pink was not just expressing a color preference, he was reasserting his absolute dominion over his domain. The woman who launched a drone to monitor a pool party was trying to seize back control through surveillance. When communication breaks down, these acts of territorial marking become the only language left, a loud, chaotic, and often ridiculous dialogue of one-upmanship. The tragedy is that in fighting so hard for a few feet of turf, both neighbors often lose the very peace and comfort they sought to protect in the first place. These neighborly wars do not always stay on the front lawn, they often march straight into a courtroom. When a case about spite fences or chicken opera reaches a judge, the entire legal system is forced to grapple with questions it never expected. The foundational laws of nuisance and trespass, designed for simple disputes over barking dogs or overgrown hedges, are stretched to their absolute limits. A judge must now rule on whether 100 ceramic gnomes constitute an intentional infliction of emotional distress, or if the low-frequency hum of an air conditioner is a legally actionable invasion. The evidence presented is unlike anything from a typical lawsuit, moving far beyond documents and into the surreal. Exhibit A might be a folder of time-stamped photographs of a parked car's tire, allegedly encroaching by 2 millimeters. Exhibit B could be a grainy drone video of a backyard barbecue, and Exhibit C might be the silent, inscrutable stare of a garden gnome, brought into the courtroom as a physical prop. Consider the legal outcome of the historical reenactment ruckus. The judge was faced with a defendant arguing his blank firing cannon was a protected form of historical education, while the plaintiffs, including a veteran with documented anxiety, argued it was a terrifying sonic assault. The ruling hinged on a nuanced interpretation of local noise ordinances, with the judge ultimately issuing a strict schedule for cannon fire, limiting it to 2 hours on Saturday afternoons and banning it outright on national holidays. This created a bizarre local precedent, effectively legalizing a one-man artillery drill for a few hours each week, a compromise that satisfied no one but the law. Similarly, the case of the solar panel glare forced a court to weigh property rights against a new kind of environmental impact. The judge had to determine if the reflected sunlight was a private nuisance, balancing the homeowner's right to green energy against the neighbor's right to not have their living room turned into a dazzling hot box. The ruling did not order the panels removed, but mandated the installation of a specialized, non-reflective coating, a solution that set a modern standard for a problem that did not exist a generation ago. The challenges for the judiciary are immense. How does a judge maintain courtroom decorum while reviewing evidence that includes a log of deflated basketballs or a custom-made bounce-free zone flag? They must sift through absurdity to find the core legal principles, often acting as amateur psychologists for warring parties who have lost all perspective. Their rulings in these quirky cases can have a lasting impact, creating a patchwork of local laws that address everything from the maximum height of a fence to the acceptable decibel level of a wind chime at 3 in the morning. Each verdict sends a ripple through the community, setting a new, often very strange, benchmark for what one neighbor can legally do to another. From squirrel espionage to spiked fences and solar glares, these 33 stories paint a vivid portrait of conflict born from the most unexpected places. They reveal how a simple disagreement over a tree branch or a misplaced basketball can escalate into a legal saga, fueled by pride and a fierce desire to defend our personal territory. These disputes are more than just bizarre anecdotes. They are cautionary tales about the fragile nature of community and the high cost of letting communication break down. The next time you wave to your neighbor, consider the delicate balance that exists between your property lines. What strange tales of suburban conflict have you encountered? Share the weirdest neighbor dispute you have ever witnessed in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more explorations into the fascinating and often unbelievable realities of everyday life.